Aside, but Wesley has frequently taken his glasses off before the start of the game. He's got them on, so I don't know if that gives him some kind of extra vision, if that will help him out here. But Wesley does seem bothered, and how could he not be? He's trailing 1-0, and now in the second set, he's also lost the first game. But this is just a position at this stage. He's not necessarily going to find winning chances with the black pieces, so if he could stabilize in this one, then go back to the drawing board with the white pieces.
Yeah, and even if he isn't able to get an advantage out the opening with black, get an attacking position out the opening with black, first you just have to survive the early stages. And I think Magnus's opening here is pretty much designed to push the tension into the middle game, into the later phases. So Wesley should be happy. I think he should be thrilled with the outcome these last few moves. Magnus pausing as well right now. Of course, it's a level position. White might be the first to try and break out in the center, but Wesley's done nothing wrong. He's got a healthy development plan here. Black's going to castle, Black's knight's going to come out, and Magnus gaining space on the flanks. It feels like Magnus is playing against e5 as a first move. It feels like he's set up in Italian fashion, but he's playing against the Sicilian, so there will be some added twists a bit later on.
Slow start to this one. Magnus keeps it in close Sicilian territory, but at some point we are expecting a central break either from white or from black, seeing that deep pawn move forward. For Wesley, right, and it does immediately. So Wesley going for d5. Magnus doesn't pause, gives a check. And before we deep dive into this analysis, I want to ask you, David, how much of a challenge is it for Wesley right now to also leave behind what has just happened in game one with the white pieces?
It's a challenge. He wouldn't be human if he didn't feel the effects, feel the kind of aftermath of that heartbreaking defeat in the previous game with white. And yeah, I think Wesley more than others, wow, moving his king out of this check, not even blocking, it definitely feels like that previous game has got to him. This might be a decent decision. There's nothing wrong with it because the center's closed, but it does feel like Wesley more than others would be kind of affected by the psychology here. And look at him, he does not look happy at all at the board. This is by far the lowest we've seen him this week.
But it was a good move. That light square bishop that just gave the check is almost trapped. If you gave Wesley the turn, that bishop is going to be eliminated. So I think that Wesley made a good practical decision in a game where he wants to give himself some chances. I think he has chances now. Even if he's looking dejected, he should be focused because Magnus has to figure out how to save that.
On the camera, and the camera images, the board, they do not match. I kind of agree with Robert here that he might be lulling his opponent into a false sense of security, Wesley, so because actually on the board it's getting a bit sharp now, and that should suit him in a situation where he needs to strike back, he needs to win at some point today. A bit of a shake of the head though, but why? It's still a tense position on the board, everything to play for, all pieces left. White's bishop will soon be trapped.
If we could get the analysis board here, because this is a critical moment, and Wesley is continuing to shake his head. He's got multiple options here, one of which is to ignore the fact that his knight's under attack and counter against the light square bishop, but he can also bring his knight back to the starting point. And how is that bishop escaping? Let's say you go knight to g8, and white plays d4. Let's free up a diagonal for the bishop. Black plays c4. Oh, no, you don't. You're not getting out of here. Now how do you save the bishop? You have to, I think, play the move pawn to a5, just to avoid this trap. But after a6, bishop a4, queen takes a5, I don't even care. And he's played knight g8, so step one, it's a good decision. You've stolen a pawn. Now Magnus has to prove the compensation. We know the black king will not be perfectly safe. It lost the right to castle. But you have the material, and this is the imbalance that you would hope to have in a must-win type of game.
This is a dream. This is a fantasy for any player in a must-win situation. He's a pawn up. And this is the most logical line right now. I think Magnus would be forced to kick that black queen away and then create some luft, some escape squares for the white bishop. But yeah, I mean, it's imbalanced. The center is blocked. There's going to be no quick draws here. You have extra material. What more could you want? Why is Wesley shaking his head right now? It's a mystery. I love his choices here. He's about to trap this white bishop.
And Magnus needs to react to that big threat on his bishop on b5. But even this final line that you just showed, the final position that you showed, it feels like because of the lack of development that we see on the board, on the right side of the board, that even down a pawn, Magnus should have compensation. But that's exactly what Wesley is aiming for right now. An imbalanced position where he's up material and his opponent, Magnus Carlsen, has to prove compensation.
And that word compensation is often one we use when we don't know how to prove that compensation. Like, oh, we see that it's even because there's compensation for the sacrifice pawn. What does that mean? What is a George Carlin skit, may he rest in peace, about compensation? But it is a word that we often use because we're not exactly sure which side we'd even prefer. White will get some chances because black lost the ability to castle. That king has already moved. And you see Magnus, he plays the move a5. And if I'm Wesley, here it comes, a6. Take that pawn on a5 and then figure out the rest later. Magnus has more to prove than Wesley at this stage.
A spicy opening and exactly the kind of perhaps chess that Fabi was earlier advocating for, going for it, taking these chances. And we're going to see Magnus trying to prove that compensation. Well, visually, it's clear that you've got to target that lack of development, that king on the f-file. Right now, hoping for a central close, that d-pawn moving forward. And perhaps we can see Magnus trying to open up that f-file to try to line that rook against the king. Move the knight, step away with that knight, get that f-pawn moving up the board, trying to create chances for a king attack.
Yeah, Magnus would love to open it, hence his last move. The pawn pushing forward to c4. Whether it's breaking open the f-file, as you indicate there, Tanya, whether it's just exploding the center somehow. If Magnus opens things, black's lack of development will come back to haunt Wesley. So this one's very much hanging in the balance. Your thoughts there about compensation, Robert, reminds me of all these old books I grew up reading. The unclear symbol, this kind of infinity symbol. It was just left at the end of any complicated variation like this because authors don't know, commentators don't know. It just looks messy. And there's no kind of specific way to define this position in one sentence. We can say black's up a pawn, white is ahead in development. But it's still up to the players to prove it. And Wesley blocks the center even further.
Well, that infinity symbol is also one for forever. And I'm forever loving this kind of chess on the board, where now we are definitely going to see some dynamics on the board, the imbalances here. And I think this makes it clear that Wesley is not hedging all his hopes on that final white game. He wants to try to get a decisive one in this one.
It's sort of Magnus's fault because the line he played is not standard against the Sicilian. As David said earlier, it's like he was playing against the king's pawn opening, trying to get an Italian game where it doesn't exist. And right now he is down a pawn. That bishop on a4, it looks like it's pinned. It could have been won, but that dark square bishop for white can always slide one square on the diagonal to hit the black queen. So even just a turn ago, before pawn to d4 was played, b5, that's a move that looks like it wins a piece because that bishop on a4, unfortunately, it can't leave as the rook on a1 is loose behind it, but bishop to d2 will take care of business, forcing the queen either or the pawn push. But that's neither here nor there because Magnus continues his development, bringing his knight into the center. That knight may go to b3 to kick the queen. It may go up to e4 and over towards the king side. That black king on f8, there aren't too many white attackers in front of it, so it's not unsafe just yet. But down the line, once the knight jumps, then the dark square bishop gets involved. And as Tanya said, maybe even pawn pushes later. It does seem like white can launch an attack. But for now, I would say the status quo is allowing black to retreat the queen, develop pieces, and say, I am a pawn to the good. Continue to prove it, Magnus. Let's see it.
Very often in these kind of pawn structures that we have, the one that black has created with the c5, d4 bind, we've been talking about the break from the f-file. You can also start targeting the base of that pawn c5. Breaks like b4 are always in the air, and watch out for them. They might come at some point. Once the queen does retreat, white will have the option to try to destabilize Wesley in the center. And we've seen these ideas in the Benoni, in the Banco, from different sides, the reversed colors. I wouldn't be surprised if the play shifts from the king side to the queen side.
Yeah, and if we look at the pawn structure, Magnus has the most advanced pawn right now, or one of the most advanced pawns in the center. It's basically cutting the board in half. So white here, with the space advantage, with the lead in piece development, is able to plant pieces in the center and then switch focus. I completely agree. And yeah, this king on f8, I really hate. It is really going to cause Wesley a lot of trouble long term. I think it's more the attitude that we're impressed with here in the studio, the fact that he's fighting. And this is what Wesley needed to show in the first game and what we're loving right now. Yes, white's position objectively is probably better. Yes, white's position is probably more fun to play because who cares about a pawn? It's more about black's king being misplaced, black's pieces half asleep on the back line. But Wesley is fighting. He's been ambitious. He's taken a pawn. He's going to try and hold on to it and definitely going to put some burden on Magnus a bit later. He does need to act energetically, though, Wesley, so the camera picture is slightly worrying on that front.
And when you're ahead by material, we're often told to trade down, and that could help in your defensive task as well, because with fewer pieces remaining on the board, there are fewer attackers that white will have. And he plays queen c7. I was wondering about bishop d7 as well, just developing while trying to trade off the light square bishops. I see the b4 plan. Tanya mentions a really good idea, trying to undermine the black pawn structure. Black can at some point take on b4, giving up the center for some queenside passers. The imbalances will continue, and that's really all you can hope for at this early stage. We're only 12 moves into this game, and Magnus, how could he be comfortable here? It's a fun-looking position. It's dynamic play, but as Fabiano was advocating for, you need to put Magnus in uncomfortable territory. This isn't preparation. This is all inspiration, and I think that for a change, it's Wesley who should be inspired to look for his advantages here. He is up a pawn. The e5 pawn may be more of a target than an asset from the white's perspective. I like the play that Wesley is showing. He just needs to keep pacing the clock and keep his confidence high.
Finally, we are seeing some ambitious chess by Wesley, so perhaps something that he had to do earlier, perhaps something that he needed to start the match with in set one itself. But now it is time for him to go for it, and that's what he does. Bishops have been offered to be traded here. Magnus goes for the more solid approach of developing pieces, getting them at the right spot before you think about any break, whether it's the f-pawn, the b-pawn, or even eyeing that d6 square. That's a nice juicy post for the knight to land on. Yes, it will result in the trade of the bishop and the knight, but if that e-pawn gets to d6, that could be a really powerful pawn as well. Is knight d6 an idea that Magnus can work towards?
Yeah, let's check it out, Tanya. Let's try and see whether Magnus can land a monster knight, an octopus knight on d6. And I'm wondering whether you trade off. Let's say we ignore it.
He answers for us,
He
David.
does trade off. Let's say we see a capture with the black knight hitting this pawn in the center, and now the white bishop comes out. If black does nothing here, I'm not sure how black does nothing, then the knight can land on d6. And just to show how strong this pawn would be in this square, I think this would actually land white a decent advantage. You open up the rook, the white knight might come in, the white queen might follow on the diagonal. Still unclear whether Magnus should rush, I will admit, but definitely on the card. So I think we'll see that first move at least hinting that the knight might land on that outpost on the board.
I think Wesley should push his h-pawn. I know you're not supposed to push pawns in front of your king when there might be an attack, but he needs to develop his knight out of g8. That knight was developed very early in the game, then had to step back to its initial square. But I would play h5 so that I could play knight h6 next. You play knight d6. I don't have to take you right away. And I think that's an important instructive moment for many people at home. They think, well, I need to take that knight. It's going to threaten me. But you could start with knight h6. There's nowhere that knight can go from d6. You can take it on the next turn or in the future. So for Wesley, he is holding on to everything in both directions. It's getting extremely complicated. There's no denying that. But this is the territory that Fabiano was saying you need to take Magnus. He's not always perfect. He plays with high accuracy. It was over 98% in those 4 games yesterday. People are going crazy on social media, and they should, because that pinpoint precision is what earned Magnus so many points. But this is the type of position that, like Ali Reza Firouzja, the style he plays, it's less accurate. I'm putting that in quotes, but it's because he's taking his opponents into this treacherous territory where it's so difficult to find the accurate continuations. I think that Wesley, he needs to keep the pace, as I've been saying, play h5, develop the knight to h6. It's a messy game. Just go with it.
And we speak so much about styles of the top players. Now, one thing's clear. To be the best in the world, to be in the top 10, you have to have a universal style. You can't have big gaping holes in one territory of the game and be extremely strong in the other. You can't give targets to your opponent. And these players, these top players, they are universal in nature. They're good in every kind of positions. But I think when we speak about stylistic chess, we're referring to instinctively and intuitively the kind of decisions that they take, David. And this kind of a position that we have in front of us, intuitively, who does it suit more?
Oof, that one is hard to say. I think actually it suits both. Well, I was going to say it doesn't suit both right now, and I think that benefits Wesley so. You talked about the deep dark forest. This looks pretty murky to me, and also we have to remember in 2019 winning the World Fischer Random Championship against Magnus Carlsen. That was random. That was kind of pieces all over the board with weird, kind of non-typical patterns, and that's where Wesley so has his chances against Magnus. No matter the objective evaluation, he's achieved at least a mess on this board. And I saw him reach for the pawn, Robert. He pushes it just one square. Either way, he's woken up, and like you say, Tanya, yes, it's kind of the style that we like to talk about players. It's about the instinct, it's about their preferences, but as long as he has enough time on the clock, he can maneuver this position, he can work with it. It's given him a great foundation to fight. So I think as long as he stays at a decent time on the clock, this position still plenty of chances as Magnus pushes his h-pawn forward as well.
Well, that caught me by surprise a little bit. I thought he would push that one square like Wesley just did instead of two, but he's taking away Wesley's immediate threat. Though that pawn h4, it does stick out. It's in front of your king. It can become a target. Magnus, he looks like he is enjoying this position. It's one where you really need to dig deep and calculate, and he's ahead on the clock. That's actually, I think, maybe the most important aspect of this position. You see the evaluation bar off to the side saying, white maybe slightly better. A lot of you saying, well, isn't there a pawn missing from this position? Both players, they don't have that assessment. They're working with their own internal assessment functions, and they know it's unclear. That is obvious. But now, where does Wesley go? His king side is not developed. He needs to get those pieces out.
Yeah. He's got an extra pawn, but he's playing without the rook on h8, without the rook on a8, and for now, even without the knight on g8. Wesley needs to find the time and moves to actually develop these pieces to make something of that extra pawn. And yes, it's exactly the kind of position that you're looking for given the mat situation. But if we keep that aside, objectively here, to me, it does look like white should have enough play with plans of the knight jumping to d6, with plans of the b pawn moving forward, undermining the center as we have it. I would pick white here. David, what about you? Robert, if you had to pick a color here, would you go for material or compensation in this one?
I think until this last move, I might have taken black, just because I like my material. Yes, white's a-pawn being absent isn't relevant right now, probably won't be relevant till the endgame, this material balance, but I thought black had stability. I don't like Wesley's last move. It's taken that square that you wanted away from that black knight on g8. It feels like this has helped Magnus, this little inclusion of pawn pushes. Magnus has gained space. Now I might take white, but... yeah, I mean, that's how fickle top chess players can be. If you ask the players, maybe they would say the same. It's unclear. I think, again, I still love what Wesley's been doing in terms of attitude, but it does feel like it doesn't suit his kind of mindset for the tournament right now.
And I'm trying to figure out what his plan was, because h4 does stop his immediate threat, which is to push the g-pawn, and he goes one square with it. So he is taking this very cautiously. It's a ginger-like approach. He's just moving slowly, trying to make things work on the king side. And meanwhile, the idea that Tanya was advocating for a long time ago, pawn to b4, has been played. So I don't like the way that Wesley's handled the last few moves. Maybe he can actually take this pawn to b4. I know he drops a central pawn in return, but things remain messy, although I am starting to like Magnus' chances because of Wesley's last two moves.
Yeah, and Magnus's practical skills are so strong. Wesley spent an age deciding to push a little pawn on the king side. Magnus instantly reacts by throwing a pawn forward on the queen side. He was thinking in his opponent's time, first of all, then he was ready to pounce on his opponent's vulnerability. And look at those white pieces in the middle of the board. Centralization over everything, and looking very strong for white right now.
And there's just so much to learn, because when I brought up the idea of b4, right, a couple of moves ago, that's what maybe many of us would do instantly. But Magnus first gets all his pieces at the right position. He develops everything, gets everything centralized, and only then strikes in the center. And that's just what I see these top grandmasters always do. They wait with the threat until the right moment.
Yeah, they build up, they strike when they sense their opponents aren't quite ready. And Magnus, he played 2-3 moves in a flurry there. Now he'll pause again, and he still has to find a plan of attack against the black king. But even if he were to take a slow approach, even if white's knight now on the d-file that just captured a pawn drops back, throw those white pawns in the center up the board, black is frozen. We've talked about it before. I was trying to avoid objective kind of assumptions here, like white being better, black being better, because I loved what Wesley was doing, taking risks. But now the dust is starting to clear, starting to settle, and black's piece is just not ready for the fight.
And white does need to keep an eye on that h4 pawn. Look at Magnus. He's creating a direct threat. That queen is in line with the black king. I think Wesley pushed his pawn one square to g6. So his king, and there it goes. It runs out of the way. We should show that a moment ago, ideas with knight takes pawn on e6 were really threatening. Bishop takes h6 check. Knight takes e6 to follow because the f7 pawn was pinned. So Wesley, he is scrambling out of the center of the board. That's the good news. And he still has a plan. He could push that h-pawn, get his knight out to h6. So Magnus does have work to do here. This isn't just like, oh, suddenly we love his position, it's game over, and he hops that knight into d6, which I think we all were saying was a good idea. If you take on d6, it's replaced by pawn. But maybe he should take it and brings queen out to c5. e6 to e5 becomes a threat in these positions. The knight now can go out to f6 instead of sitting at home on g8. So at least for Wesley, there are some plans for him in this position as compared to before where he was completely frozen.
Yeah, I actually think he'll be loving this little transition as black, Wesley. So I'm expecting him to use the c5 square as well for the black queen. But it's just the fact that at least now he has something clear to do. Earlier, it was very kind of, it was very unclear to say the least about where black's pieces should go. But this knight coming out will be a lifesaver. And wow, he drops back with the black queen instead. That feels a bit odd somehow, feels counterintuitive. The black queen's so passive, but still, he's getting developed. That black knight coming out. Magnus needs to strike here and now, still a pawn down.
Yeah, but he could have gotten developed with tempo, put pressure on white's pieces, attack that knight on d4, keep your queen connected to that d6 pawn. I loved your idea of queen to c5, the more active approach in this position, which would be the logical follow-up to what Wesley has been doing with his play so far. Once again, to me, this just reflects Wesley's cautious, overly cautious play.
I think part of it, though, is done because of the time. I'm looking at Wesley's clock. He only has 4 minutes remaining. That b7 pawn was a bit loose. So maybe he's just saying, I'm going to defend everything. And perhaps he believes in the foundation of his position because he is going to play knight f6 next. His rooks will be connected. And that pawn on d6, which really is a thorn in black's side. In fact, it forced the queen backwards. That's something that you have to keep an eye on. Maybe Magnus will have to drop that later in the game if he can't keep it under control. And the last thing I'll say is that bishop on f4, if that were on b2, oh, this could be game over. So I'm already actually thinking of rerouting that bishop back to c1. Retreating moves often the hardest to play in chess, but as a commentator, I always have to say, look what your pieces are, look where they'd be best placed. A dream move could be a killer move, and a bishop getting back on over there at some point, maybe even now, could really hurt Wesley.
That's a really nice plan that you're pointing out, Robert, about rerouting that bishop from f4 to the killer diagonal, the sniper that it would be on that b2 square. And perhaps that's something on Magnus's agenda right now. We speak about AlphaZero all the time. We speak about how Magnus channels his own AlphaZero and that h4. Do you want to include h5 in this position? Do you want to fix that pawn on h5? Or do you think this is the better pawn structure for white?
I think this is a fine pawn structure for white. I think keep that up your sleeve for later. It's always going to be in the air, pawn to h5 for white, trying to break open the black king. Why rush when it might become stronger later when things have cleared up a bit? I'm loving the white bishop stepping back. White's rooks at some point need to join the fun, but Magnus in the tank now for 2 minutes. Again, it's that murky type of position which nobody's comfortable in. Fabiano said it himself. Fabi, in those games against Magnus, he won 3 of them. He wasn't comfortable, but nor was Magnus, and that is already step 1. And you can see Magnus not entirely sure what he should be doing next. It looks nice, pretty for white, but you're still a pawn down. That's in the back of your mind. Match situation in the back of your mind, and anything could still happen here.
And those are exactly the kind of positions we saw in the AI Cup, where Maxime booked his ticket to Toronto. He took down Magnus not in 1 set, but in 2 sets in the finals. And it was exactly these kind of chaotic positions where both players have chances, opportunities to go completely wrong, a mess on the board, and Maxime was on top of that. And it feels like Fabi took a leaf out of that Maxime book and created his chances and won 3 games against Magnus in these positions. So Wesley's managed to achieve it, but the one thing that is a little different from those other 2 storylines is the clock situation, because Fabi and Maxime also did keep pressure on the clock. And right now I see Wesley failing to do that.
But Magnus is in for a 3+ minute think at this stage. You are right that Wesley's been trailing on the clock, but right here, right now, if Magnus continues to be perplexed by the position because it's super complicated, then Wesley can say, all right, I'm not getting checkmated. I'm still a pawn ahead. And look at those queenside passed pawns that Wesley has. He has 3 pawns on the A and B files, and that pawn on B4, that one could be an annoying passer. And that pawn on D6, the most advanced white pawn, as we've been talking about, that can actually be scooped up at some point if Magnus isn't careful. And Magnus, he's down below 3 minutes 40.